In this tutorial, I'm going to be going through the detailing process of my 3 characters. The process for all 3 is exactly the same. I fast forwarded it quite a lot because this was probably about 4 or 5 hours worth of work over a couple of sessions. So you might see a bit of chopping and changing between where I stopped and started, but essentially I managed to get everything on film, so you'll be able to see the entire process. I'll try not to talk too much during this one because, as I said, the process is the same, and I'll just explain briefly what I'm doing whilst I'm creating the detail and the shadowing on all 3 of my characters. So what you can see me doing here is I actually started with his chest, but I'm on the leg at the moment. I'm actually colouring right over the top of my line art, and as I am progressing, I am blending that line art into the detail, which can be a little bit unnerving. I've never actually worked this way before. This is the first time I've worked like this, and I got this technique from watching a particular tutorial of another artist explaining the process. It is a little bit tricky at first getting used to. I'm using the mixer brush tool here, and I've once again never used that before either, but I've grown to really love it, and I think when I am doing works from now on, I think I will actually change to this way of doing things. Usually I leave my line art in and I colour within that, and I detail and do my shadowing with big solid sharp blocks of colour. I have never blended like this before, so this particular character as well is a first attempt for me at detailing in this way. I think it turned out pretty good considering it was a first effort. I really quite enjoy using the mixer brush tool, and it's just a process really of following the line art and using the lines to shape where I'm going, where I need to put my shadows and my darker colours. Then from that point, it's just a matter of changing the shades of the colour that I'm working with and using those with the mixer brush tool to form, where the muscles are, and making flat shapes look three-dimensional. The tricky part was trying to make his markings still look sharp without the line art, and so I did have to actually go back in after I'd blended the colours. Sometimes, because when you're blending the yellow next to the purple, sometimes it bleeds a little bit, as you can see on his foot a little bit there. But what I do is I just go back in with a normal brush tool and just sharpen those up a bit later on. And as I progress, you can see me edging out the outside, and I'm just using the eraser tool to edge out the shape of the character from the outside. And then, because this takes away the line art as well, this edging needs to be quite sharp and quite detailed, so I need to be very careful about how I'm erasing the colour around the outside, because that then forms the shape of the outside, and that's just as important as the blending on the inside. These buttons were a bit tricky. Buttons, they're bolts, they were a bit tricky. I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to colour them, so this was a little bit of trial and error here. Trying to make them look three-dimensional was a bit of a challenge. It wasn't so bad with the ones on his leg because they're yellow bolts on his purple markings, whereas the one on his hand, which I think is coming up pretty soon, was really tricky because the bolt is the same colour as his hand. You can see me sort of going over it a few times there and trying to get the darker colours around the outside just to try and separate it from the hand so you can see it. So I'm just going over his chest there, trying to blend in the line art into his marking, so I'm getting rid of those bleeding out bits there, you can see. And I'm just doing this with a normal brush tool. Bit of a mix of the brush tool with the mixer brush tool as well. His hair, wow, that was really hard. I actually had no idea how I was going to tackle his dreadlocks. You can see I've only kind of done a few lines in the line art to kind of just show where the hair will be, but you'll see at the end it just didn't matter. Really, I didn't really need the line art at all. I started following the line art, but as I progressed, I just really didn't like how his hair was turning out. And because I was so pleased with the rest of his body, I didn't want the hair to ruin the whole image. So I spent quite a bit of time here before I actually worked out the best way to do it. And at this point, I was just kind of in despair because I really wasn't turning out the way I wanted it to. But I kept persevering, and then accidentally I found the solution, which is coming up in a minute. So yeah, I'm thinking, at this point, maybe if I put a few dark ones in there to distinguish them from the lighter ones, we might see a bit more depth here. But the mixer brush tool just wasn't working as well with the hair as it did with his body. And then I thought maybe edging it out there made a little bit of a difference, but it's at this point here you can see I'm starting to spike his hair out, and I've used the smudge tool, and I got it out for purely just to try and see what would happen, and this is what happened. And I was absolutely jumping for joy because it made his hair look exactly like lightning, and I was just absolutely amazed by how wonderful and accidental trial and error worked out. Yeah, I ended up finishing his hair, and as you can see, the line art didn't really matter that much in the end because I kind of just made new lines with that smudge tool. So I've started on the Earth character now. Same process, exactly the same process actually, and she was a lot easier. I managed to get her done in 2 sessions, where it took me 3 sessions for the previous character. I feel like she didn't turn out as well as the first character did. I'm not really sure why that is, but I didn't have as much fun with her as I did the first character, which is unusual because I usually enjoy creating female characters over male ones. I think maybe it was because the first one was a bit of a novelty to be using a new technique. Maybe that's why I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more. Her hair wasn't as fun as his hair was once I figured out what I was doing, and her vine was very tricky to get right. I needed to really make sure that looked 3-dimensional in her hand, and I found that a bit difficult. I've used the same technique or a similar technique with the smudge tool with bits of her hair coming out there too. Once I realised how appropriate it was for hair in this situation, I used it with all three characters. I think the 3D effect did come up quite good on her leg there in the end. I was pretty pleased with it. It's just a matter of getting the shadowing in the correct places and showing light in the right spots as well. So I'm onto the fire character now. She didn't take as long as the other two. Obviously, she's a lot smaller and she doesn't require as much detail, or at least she doesn't need to be as realistic as the other two. So, and as I mentioned before, I ended up simplifying her colour scheme down to just the two main colours, and that made life a lot easier as well. I didn't mind about being so worried about how detailed her hands were and things like that. I wasn't sure how to tackle her hair either. I thought I would just figure it out as I went, and I was happy how it turned out in the end. There is something very satisfying about the outlining process where I'm erasing the edges around the body. Somehow that part, making that part really sharp and crisp, really makes the figure, like particularly when I'm doing the hair and outlining the shape of the hair by erasing the stuff in the negative space. It's very satisfying. It all seems to come together when I'm doing this process. The hair, the curls in particular, they just look absolutely amazing when I do that. And, you know, I need to obviously have a really, really fine pointed eraser when I'm doing that to make sure I'm getting it as crisp as possible. But, I mean, her hair really looks like flames there next to her arm, and it just worked out absolutely perfectly. Same with that bit there. I was really happy with how her hair worked out. My new best friend, the smudge tool, made an appearance again here. And because I'd had a bit of practice with it at this point, it just worked perfectly with the flames, and it was just adding more lighter coloured bits of hair. It really looks like she's got a campfire on her head. It's great. And the same for this flame here. Smudge tool in the middle, it just worked perfectly for these elemental properties. Getting the smoke right here was a bit of a struggle, but I did manage in the end. And that pretty much concludes the process, so thanks for watching.